They say some doors only open once in a lifetime, and only for those who shouldn't step through. At exactly 3:13 a.m., in a forgotten alley behind a shuttered pharmacy, a door appears where there's only brick during the day. Inside is a library, endless shelves of books no one's ever written, titles that know your secrets, and whispers that know your name. Ethan saw the door once. He swore he'd never go back. But last night, the clock struck 3:13, and the door was waiting for him. Part 1, the door between minutes. The streets of Hawthorne were never truly silent, not even in the dead hours between night and morning. There was always a hum, the distant whir of traffic 2 blocks away, the faint buzz of an aging street lamp, the restless scurry of something small in the alley shadows. But tonight, the hum was gone. Ethan Graves noticed it the moment he stepped out of his apartment building. No wind, no traffic, no animals. Just stillness, so complete it felt staged. He tugged his coat tighter. The February air bit at his cheeks, but he wasn't walking for fresh air. Ethan had been an insomniac for years, but lately, his nights had taken on a ritual. Around 2:30, when the ceiling felt too close and the bed too empty, he'd pull on his coat, shove his hands in his pockets, and wander the city's forgotten streets until the heaviness in his chest eased. It was on these walks that he noticed things other people missed, the way a certain lamp flickered like clockwork, the smell of wet stone after a night without rain, the locked gate that sometimes stood ajar with no sign of who had moved it. But tonight was different. Tonight, his steps didn't echo. His breath seemed to vanish before it could fog in front of him. And when he glanced up at the nearest street lamp, its light was too steady, too bright, as if it had been turned up for his benefit alone. He kept walking, trying not to look like someone who'd just realized they were the only actor on stage. The clock on the pharmacy sign blinked 3:12 a.m. in cold red digits. Ethan turned down Willow Lane, a narrow alley flanked by brick buildings whose windows hadn't lit in years. He'd walked it 100 times, because it connected directly to an old pedestrian street that led back to his apartment. He knew every crack in the pavement, every stain on the bricks. Which is why he stopped dead halfway down. Because between 2 buildings that had always been pressed shoulder to shoulder, wall against wall, there was now a door. It was set into a short recess that hadn't been there before, framed by stone blocks slick with recent rain. The door itself was oak, tall enough that it seemed to stretch unnaturally high, with a frosted glass pane etched in looping script. The penumbra library warm light pulsed faintly behind the glass, gold and steady, like firelight. Ethan's first thought was, that's not possible. His second was, I'm not dreaming. I don't dream anymore. He looked back down the alley. The pharmacy sign still blinked in the distance. 3:13 a.m. And in the space between one blink and the next, he swore he heard something. A rustle. A whisper. The faint, crisp sound of a page being turned. Every reasonable part of him said keep walking. The sensible thing to do was go home, lock the door, and pretend none of this existed. But insomnia does strange things to a person. It erodes the edges between fear and curiosity. Before he could think better of it, Ethan stepped closer. The brass handle was worn, cold to the touch. The moment he wrapped his fingers around it, a shiver went through him, not from the cold, but from something deeper, like the memory of being touched in a dream. The door opened soundlessly. The first breath of air inside smelled of rain-soaked stone, candle wax, and something faintly metallic. And the space. It was impossible. The building it was squeezed between could barely fit a storage closet, but the room beyond was vast. Vaulted ceilings stretched into shadows, lined with shelves that reached so high he couldn't see where they ended. The floor was old wood, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Tall lamps cast golden pools of light over heavy reading tables, each set with a single candle in a brass holder. Somewhere far off, he heard the soft scrape of a chair moving. Ethan stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a muffled thud, and when he glanced back, the frosted glass pane was gone. In its place was a solid wall of bookshelves. For a while, he simply wandered. Every shelf was crammed with books whose spines were aged and cracked, some bound in leather, others in strange cloth that shimmered faintly under the light. The air had that peculiar weight found only in old libraries, where sound is swallowed whole. One book caught his eye, a thin black volume titled The Street Lamp That Flickered for No One. He slid it from the shelf and opened it at random. The page was filled with neat, looping handwriting describing a night, years ago, when a young man watched a certain street lamp flicker in a deserted alley. Ethan froze. It was his alley. It was him. Down to the detail of his coat, the sound of his footsteps, the restless way he kept looking over his shoulder. He shoved the book back and moved on, pulse quickening. 2 shelves over, his gaze landed on a thicker book bound in deep green leather. The title was embossed in gold, Ethan Graves. His full name. He pulled it free with trembling hands. The first page was blank. The second was not. The handwriting was the same as before, but now it was writing as he read. It described the exact position of his hands, the faint tremor in his left thumb, the way his heartbeat stuttered as his eyes moved across the page. He flipped forward, and there it was. The next thing you hear will be the sound of someone whispering your name from behind. Ethan's breath caught. The silence in the library deepened. And then, so soft it could have been the creak of an old floorboard, he heard it. Ethan, right behind his ear. Part 2, the book that knew too much. Ethan's skin went cold. The whisper had been so close that for a split second, his mind filled in the sensation of breath brushing his ear, but when he turned, there was nothing. No one. The aisle behind him was empty, stretching away into shadows between the towering shelves. The only movement was the slow flicker of a candle's flame somewhere far down the row. He swallowed hard and forced a laugh, the kind you make when trying to convince yourself nothing's wrong. But his fingers tightened around the green leather book. The writing inside hadn't stopped. He turns, but there is no one there. The book is still in his hands. He will pretend it's nothing. He will fail. Ethan slammed it shut. He stood there for a moment, breathing too fast, every nerve tuned to the faint sounds in the library, the hum of unseen lamps, the creak of the ancient floorboards settling, the subtle rustle that might have been books shifting on their own. He needed to get out. The problem was, he couldn't find the door. He retraced his steps, or what he thought were his steps, but the layout seemed subtly altered. Shelves he was sure had been on his right were now on his left. The reading tables were arranged differently, like the entire room had quietly rearranged itself the moment he turned his back. The smell of candle wax was stronger now, undercut by something else, something faintly sweet and rotten. He was halfway down another aisle when a voice cut through the stillness. "You found your volume early." Ethan froze. At the far end of the aisle stood a man, or at least, something shaped like one. He was tall, too tall, with narrow shoulders draped in a dark, old-fashioned coat. His skin was pale in a way that didn't look unhealthy so much as unlit. Black gloves clung to long fingers stained with something darker at the tips, ink, Ethan thought. Or hoped. The man's eyes were the worst part. Not because of their color, pale gray, almost silver, but because they didn't seem to move quite right. They lingered on him like they'd been looking at him for much longer than he'd been in the room. Ethan's voice caught. I don't know what you mean. The man, the librarian, Ethan thought without knowing why, stepped closer. You carry it, he said, nodding toward the book in Ethan's grip. Your own record. Most visitors don't find theirs until much later. That is, unless they've been expected. I'm leaving, Ethan said, trying to inject his voice with a confidence he didn't feel. Of course you will, the librarian replied, almost warmly. But you should know the rules, for your own safety. He moved past Ethan without brushing him, yet somehow close enough to make the air tighten. As he did, Ethan caught a faint scent, not of paper or ink, but of something colder, like the air before a storm. Rule 1, the librarian said, read only what you can bear to remember. He stopped at the end of the aisle, glancing back. Rule 2, return before the 7th chime. Ethan opened his mouth to ask what chime, but the librarian was already walking away, his steps soundless on the wood. The rules rattled around in Ethan's head as he kept moving. He wasn't sure whether he was looking for the exit or just avoiding that man. But each aisle seemed stranger than the last, some filled with books whose titles were written in languages he didn't recognize, others with volumes whose covers were blank but warm to the touch. One shelf held nothing but small, weathered journals, each with a name etched faintly on the spine. He ran a finger over one that read Lena Moretti, a name he was sure he'd never heard before, and felt a shiver crawl up his arm. He didn't open it. When he finally found the door, it was waiting for him at the end of an aisle that looked oddly familiar, as if the library had grown tired of keeping him. The frosted glass pane glowed faintly, the gold letters just visible, the Penumbra Library. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open and stepped into the cool night air. The alley was exactly as it had been before, silent, still, the faint red glow of the pharmacy sign blinking in the distance. It read 3:20 a.m. Ethan walked home in a daze. The more distance he put between himself and the library, the more his memory of it felt, slippery, like trying to recall the details of a dream. By the time he reached his apartment door, he was half convinced it hadn't happened at all. He tossed his coat over the chair, sat on the edge of his bed, and rubbed his eyes. That's when he noticed he was still holding the book. It sat heavy in his hands, the green leather cool against his skin. He didn't remember taking it with him. In fact, he remembered leaving it on the shelf. But here it was. He considered throwing it away. Burning it. But the thought of opening it again tugged at him like an itch under the skin. He flipped it open to the page where he'd stopped reading. The handwriting was as neat as before. The first sentence made his chest tighten. He tries to sleep, but the book will not let him. In an hour, he will notice the first change. Ethan snapped it shut. He didn't want to know. But that night, lying in bed, he found himself listening for the hum of the city beyond his walls. It wasn't there. And when he finally drifted into a shallow, restless half-sleep, he dreamed of shelves stretching endlessly upward, and somewhere in the dark above, the faint sound of pages turning. Mini cliffhanger ending. The next evening, when Ethan stepped outside just to check, just to make sure, the alley was empty. until the pharmacy clock blinked 3:13 a.m., and the door appeared again. Part 3, The Missing Hour. Ethan hadn't meant to go back. All day, the green leather book sat on his kitchen table, like a sleeping animal he didn't trust enough to touch. He tried to ignore it, made coffee, washed dishes, scrolled through the news, but every so often his eyes would drift toward it. Each time, he swore it looked like it had moved slightly. At one point, the book lay open. He didn't remember opening it. The entry on the page was short, written in that same looping hand. By the time he notices the missing hour, it will already be too late. He snapped it shut and shoved it into a drawer. That night, he told himself he wouldn't leave the apartment. And for a while, he didn't. He sat on the couch, watching mindless TV, the clock on his wall ticking in its usual steady rhythm. But around 2:50 a.m., a strange restlessness set in, not like his usual insomnia, but heavier, like being pulled toward something. By 3:05, he was pacing. By 3:10, he had his coat on. The streets were the same as before, eerily quiet, the city's usual nighttime hum absent. He told himself he just wanted to check. To confirm the door wasn't there. But as he turned onto Willow Lane, the pharmacy sign's red digits clicked over, 3:13 a.m. And the golden glow bloomed between the brick walls. The penumbra library was exactly as he remembered, and not. The lamps were dimmer. The shelves leaned at odd angles, like the room itself was tired. Somewhere far away, he heard the creak of a chair, followed by the faint hiss of whispering voices. The librarian was nowhere in sight. Ethan told himself he'd leave after 5 minutes. Just a quick look around, maybe confirm he hadn't imagined the whole thing. But then he noticed something that stopped him mid-step. A table near the center of the room was piled high with books. Not shelved neatly like the rest, just stacked, haphazard, as if someone had been tearing through them. The top book had a title stamped in gold, Tomorrow's Last Sunrise. Ethan's stomach tightened. He opened it and scanned the page at random. The text described a man standing at a window, watching the dawn light creep over the horizon, until it stopped. Until the sun froze in place. He set it down quickly. Another book caught his eye, a thin, gray-covered one titled The Woman in Apartment 2B. He knew that address. It was in his own building. He didn't know the tenant well, just a quiet woman in her 40s who always carried a canvas bag, but the book's description was unmistakable. He read the first few lines, and his throat went dry. It detailed her evening the night before, right down to the fact she'd dropped her keys in the hallway. Ethan remembered hearing them clatter when he passed her door. The next page was worse. It began describing tonight. At 3:17 a.m., it claimed, she would walk out her door and never come back. Ethan's hands trembled as he set the book down. That was when he saw it, a locked gate at the far end of the room, made of dark iron bars. Above it, in tarnished brass letters, a sign read, The Stacks Beyond Time. Something in him, the same reckless curiosity that had brought him here the first time, pushed him toward it. The lock was old, the kind you'd expect to see on a cellar door, and when he touched it, it clicked open without resistance. The gate swung inward with a groan. Beyond was a narrow passage lined with shelves unlike any in the main library. Here, books were replaced by objects, jars filled with cloudy liquid, cracked pocket watches frozen at odd times, rolls of film in unlabeled canisters. He passed a jar labeled August 14, 1972, 6:05 p.m. Inside, suspended in the liquid, was a single lit match. Farther down, a mirror hung between two shelves. The glass was cracked, but the face it reflected wasn't quite his own. The eyes were wrong, too sharp, and the mouth smiled even though he wasn't smiling. Somewhere ahead, a faint glow pulsed in time with a slow, steady rhythm. It wasn't light exactly, more like the suggestion of light, a heartbeat seen through the air. Ethan moved toward it, ignoring the prickling at the back of his neck. That was when he noticed another book. It lay on a small pedestal in the center of the aisle, half burned, its edges blackened and brittle. The title, though scorched, was still readable, Ethan Graves. His fingers itched to open it. The moment he did, he wished he hadn't. The pages weren't in the neat, looping handwriting he'd seen before. These were jagged, rushed, some words smudged as if written in a shaking hand. Whole sentences were missing, eaten away by fire. But one line stood out, unburned and perfectly clear. At the 7th chime, the library will not let you leave. A sound rang out in the distance. One deep, resonant chime. Ethan's breath hitched. He turned to leave, but the shelves had shifted again. The passage seemed narrower, the objects pressing in, the air heavier. The glow at the far end flickered, and the jarred match light on the shelf beside him guttered out entirely. Somewhere far behind, the 2nd chime echoed through the stacks. Mini cliffhanger ending, Ethan broke into a run, clutching the burned book. But the gate he'd entered through was gone, and in its place, the librarian stood, eyes like pale glass. "You've read ahead," he said softly. "You can't unread the ending." The 3rd chime rang. Part 4, the stacks beyond time. The 3rd chime faded into the air like smoke. Ethan backed away from the librarian, heart pounding. The man didn't move, or rather, it felt like he didn't need to. His presence filled the narrow passage completely, as though the shelves bent inward to accommodate him. "You shouldn't be here," the librarian said. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact, like the way you'd say, "It's raining." "I didn't mean to," Ethan began, but his voice broke. "You've read ahead." The librarian's pale eyes flicked to the half-burned book clutched in Ethan's hands. "That makes you part of the ending now." The 4th chime sounded. The shelves shuddered. It wasn't an earthquake. The movement was organic, like the wood itself was breathing. Gaps opened between boards that hadn't been there before, revealing darkness deeper than shadow. From somewhere beyond the shelves, whispers swelled, hundreds of voices overlapping in a language Ethan couldn't understand. His skin prickled as a cool draft slid through the aisle, carrying the smell of wet earth. The librarian stepped aside. "You may try to leave," he said. "But the library doesn't like being left unfinished." Ethan ran. The passage was different now, narrower, winding where it had been straight. Objects on the shelf seemed to watch him, a weeping porcelain doll missing both eyes, a pocket watch ticking backward, a snow globe swirling black instead of white. The 5th chime rang. The sound vibrated through his chest, making his teeth ache. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with someone. It was a man in a threadbare suit, face gray and hollow, holding an open book that bled ink down his wrists like fresh wounds. His lips moved, but no sound came out, only the fluttering noise of turning pages. Ethan sidestepped him, heart in his throat. Farther along, he saw others, a child clutching a scorched teddy bear, her eyes 2 empty sockets filled with static. A woman in a red coat flipping through blank pages that slowly filled with text as she turned them. A tall, shadowless figure pacing an aisle, muttering names under its breath. The main library was ahead now, or at least it looked that way. He could see the warm candlelight spilling from the open aisles, hear the faint scratch of pen on paper. He burst through the iron gate, but the space beyond had changed. The reading tables were gone. Shelves leaned like crooked teeth, each lined with identical green leather books. He recognized the gold lettering, Ethan Graves. Row after row of them. The sixth chime rang. The sound shook the air. The shelves groaned and began to twist, their wood stretching into shapes that almost resembled fingers. The space between them narrowed, closing like jaws. Ethan shoved through, grabbing at shelves for balance, and recoiling when one shuddered under his touch, like flesh beneath thin skin. The librarian's voice carried through the shifting aisles. "You shouldn't have read your own ending." Ethan ignored him and kept moving, clutching the burned book tighter. He could see it now, the door. The frosted glass glowed faintly ahead, the letters of the penumbra library just visible through the haze. He ran for it. Something moved in the corner of his vision. From between two shelves, a long, pale hand shot out, fingers too many, too thin. It caught the edge of his coat and yanked hard. Ethan stumbled backward, slamming into another shelf, which groaned and began to bend around him like a closing fist. He tore free, ripping the seam of his coat, and staggered into the open aisle. The seventh chime began to ring. It was deafening up close, a single, deep note that seemed to last forever. The air thickened. The candlelight dimmed to embers. Every figure in the library turned toward him at once, their heads snapping in unnatural unison. The librarian stepped into view, blocking the door. "You can't leave now," he said. "Not until the story is complete." Ethan's grip tightened on the burned book. "What if I finish it myself?" Something flickered in the librarian's expression, amusement, maybe. "Then make it worth reading." The chime ended. Mini cliffhanger ending, Ethan lunged forward, shoving past the librarian and bursting through the door, only to find himself not in the alley, but standing in the library again, except this time, it was empty. Completely empty. One table stood in the center, lit by a single candle. On it lay a fresh, unburned book titled Ethan Graves. The first page was blank, except for one sentence: "This is where the ending begins." Part 5, the last chime. Ethan stared at the single sentence. "This is where the ending begins." The candle's flame wavered, though no draft stirred the air. He touched the page, the paper was warm. Almost pulsing. Somewhere deep in the library, the eighth chime began to toll. There had never been an eighth. The sound rolled through the room like a pressure wave. The floorboards flexed under his feet, and the shelves began to lean inward, groaning, their wood stretching and splitting to reveal something darker inside, not shadow, but an absence, a hole in the world. The candle flickered again, sputtered, then burned taller and hotter, casting everything in an amber glow that felt more like a warning than light. From behind him came footsteps, slow, deliberate. "You've gone past the chimes," the librarian said. His voice was almost pleased. "Few make it this far." Ethan didn't turn. "How do I get out?" "You don't," the librarian replied. "You end." Ethan gripped the book with both hands. If it was writing his life as it happened, maybe he could take control. He flipped ahead, but the pages were blank, stretching on, until the very last one, where a single sentence waited. He ran for the door but didn't make it in time. No, Ethan whispered, tearing the page out. The air trembled. The floor beneath him shuddered like a living thing. The shelf screamed, not creaking wood, but actual screaming, as their contents spilled into the air, loose pages, burned scraps, shards of glass from the jars. Somewhere above, the roof was gone, replaced by an infinite ceiling of darkness, and books were rising into it like startled birds. Ethan ran. He didn't know which direction he was going. The aisles were folding in on themselves, bending in ways that hurt to look at, but he kept his eyes on where the door should be. The librarian moved alongside him without walking, appearing in each aisle as Ethan passed, his ink-stained gloves brushing the spines of books that shivered at his touch. "You can't change the ending," he said, voice calm in the chaos. "You can only delay it." The ground split open beneath Ethan's feet. He leapt across a jagged gap, landing hard, the burned book clutched to his chest. Ahead, there. The golden glow of the frosted glass. He hurled himself toward it as the shelves leaned in, the darkness between them pressing closer like closing jaws. The librarian's voice was right behind his ear now. "If you leave now, you'll never know how it truly ends." "I don't care," Ethan shouted, slamming into the door. He spilled out into the alley. Cold air rushed his lungs. Street lamp light gleamed off wet pavement. The pharmacy sign blinked 3:14 a.m. The door was gone. Only the brick wall remained, slick with rain. Ethan stood there for a long moment, shaking. He looked down. The burned book was still in his hands. At home, he threw it onto the kitchen table and backed away like it might bite him. But hours later, when the sun rose, when the noise of the waking city filled the air again, his curiosity broke through. He opened it. The pages were blank. Completely blank. Days passed. Ethan avoided Willow Lane, avoided staying up past midnight. It almost worked. Until one Saturday afternoon, walking downtown, he saw it. In the front window of a small used bookstore he'd never noticed before, a single book was on display. Green leather. Gold lettering. The Library That Only Appears at 3:13 a.m., by Ethan Graves. He stepped closer, staring at the cover. His reflection in the glass looked wrong. The smile came a second too late. He opened the door to the shop. The bell above it chimed once, and the smell of candle wax and rain-soaked stone wrapped around him like an embrace. Somewhere in the stacks, a page turned. Final twist ending, the book in the window was gone. In its place sat a small brass sign, "Welcome back. You were never supposed to leave."